Buenos días a todos, bienvenidos a otro de nuestros seminarios coorganizados con la Universidad de Chile, la Facultad de Economía y Negocios con José de Gregorio. Hoy vamos a tener el seminario en inglés. Vamos a tener el chance de hablar con Raghuram. Déjenme dar las instrucciones en inglés y pasar. Hi everybody, good morning. It's a great pleasure that you can join us this morning to chat with one of the greatest ones in corporate finance and development economics in the world, Rajan. I just want to remind everybody, we will use the chat and the questions, the Q&As to get your questions. Please, we prefer if you put them in the Q&A because people can vote the questions and we can know what is the most important aspects that are concerning you, and we would love to know that. But if you put your questions in the chat, we will also be paying attention. Both Jose and I, we will be actually doing that. So let me pass the baton to Jose to introduce the speaker of today. Thank you again for joining. Jose, you're muted.
Hi, it is a pleasure to be with all of you again, and it, of course, a pleasure and an honor to have here Rajan, an old friend and a wonderful economist. He's currently the Catherine Daszak Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at Chicago Booth School. He was the governor of the Central Bank of India between 2013 and 2016. Before that, he was also a chief economist and director of research at the International Monetary Fund. He has a very prolific and productive career. He has worked on banking, corporate finance, but also on economic development and the interaction between finance and development. He has written a number of books and a number of papers. And of course, his concerns about finance has also been related to the concerns about globalization, inequality, and development. And that's the focus of one of his great books, Fault Lines, that was awarded the Financial Times Goldman Sachs Prize for the Best Business Book in 2010. And now he's written The Third Pillar. Raghu also became popularly very famous because in the 2005 conference at Jackson Hole that has most central bankers around the world in a meeting, and he was the chief economist at the IMF. He asked the question, is too much financial globalization dangerous? Are we too much at the risk? And he raised a lot of concerns that excessive financial development could be a threat for financial stability around the world. This was 2 years before the global financial crisis started. He was, of course, criticized by other very famous and distinguished economists, and he proved to be right. And now more recently, he's also very concerned about the issues of inequality, the role of communities. He has been working on the cost of globalization and how all this may impact our prospect for development. So it is really a pleasure to have here Raghu. I won't talk more. I think that you can say much better what I would like to say. So please, Raghu, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to you and Roberto for inviting me to speak. Let me get straight to the point, which is first, what is the third pillar? In fact, what are the first and the second? And why do we care? Well, the first pillar, I would argue, is markets. And typically, that's the economic side. The second pillar is the state, governments, including federal governments, the judiciary, the executive, the legislature. And the third pillar is the community. So if you think of the markets as the economic side, the government as the political side, the community is the social side. Now, the standard view of liberal society, which dominated the world, over the last few decades, is that it is composed of strong markets, which are very competitive, as well as governments which enforce contracts and property rights. Much of the debate in the 20th century was how much of each is necessary. And with the socialists or communists pushing more the idea that governments were much more important, markets were detrimental, while the free market types pushed the idea that we needed minimalist government and markets should do much. Now, both these arguments typically neglect the third pillar, which is the community, which is critical to making the other two pillars work. I mean, through democracy and directly, it makes the markets and the state work for the many. And when the many are satisfied, they are happy to support the system. And what I would argue is in the last few years, what we've seen is really a breakdown in the community in many ways, which has, in a sense, created fissures in the support for markets and the government, and has led to a lot of the polarization, the political dysfunctionality that we see today. And therefore, to my mind, the answer to how we rebuild trust in the system, how we rebuild support to the system, lies in strengthening the quality of the community more broadly. So that's where we're going. Let me start first with why have there been changes? And often when you look at changes in the bigger picture in economies around the world, typically the catalyst for change is technology. And even here, I would argue that's the biggest source of change, that the information and communication technology revolution over the last 4 or 5 decades has really changed markets, has changed the state, and in the process, therefore, changed the space for the community. So let's talk first markets. Markets, we've seen a tremendous expansion in the size of markets. Local community markets have become national markets have become international markets. And today we really have the possibility of producing anywhere, almost any time. Of course, this expansion in production and trade, coming from global supply chains, has not been uniformly beneficial across the world. It certainly has hit the manufacturing hubs in industrial countries, which were where much of the manufacturing was done earlier, especially if you are a big employer in a small town. The fact that you have global competition and causes you to shut down your factory causes enormous stress in that small town. But it's not been uniform losers in the industrial countries. The ones who have benefited are highly skilled service jobs centered around mega cities like Boston or San Francisco. And these have benefited from the tremendous increase in markets around the world. Now, not only have markets changed the importance of different places, typically mega cities benefiting, rural or semi-urban areas losing out in this process. It's also across the spectrum of jobs caused big differences. Economists love to point out that automation and outsourcing tends to depress the number of jobs of middle quality, while expanding both highly skilled jobs as well as jobs at the bottom, low-skilled jobs. So, for example, being a tax accountant was a honorable profession, required some skills. You needed to know the tax code, generated significant incomes, made you middle class. Today, that tax accountant, for the most part, has been replaced by TurboTax or tax cut. These are tax programs in the United States. And typically, the job that they did, even if you don't want to do your taxes, you can hire a high school grad who knows how to run the program, who doesn't need to know very much about the tax code to do your taxes for you. So it has de-skilled that particular job, even while it has skilled or upskilled the job of highly skilled tax lawyers who benefit now from having a global market where they can sell their services and can benefit rich people across the world. So the ICT revolution has changed markets by changing the relative importance of different places, but also reducing the jobs in the middle, causing people to need much higher skills if they want a decent income. The ICT revolution has also changed the state. One of the sort of fallacies in the 20th century was the state and markets were substitutes. And in fact, what we see is in the outcome with the welfare states that have developed is that they're actually complements. As the markets expand, the state expands along with it. And this has a number of implications. One, typically the location of power in the state has moved up from the local level to the national level and now to the international level, along with the expansion of markets. Why is this? It's because market participants like to see common rules, common regulations, which is why firms in the European Union want to see some kind of a uniformity in the rules that apply across the union. Otherwise, it's not really a common market, they believe, and they can't really locate anywhere because they would find different rules and regulations. So governance powers have migrated up. The most obvious example is with banking regulation. When banks were in the local community, the regulation was local. As banks became national, the regulation moved to the national capitals. Today, banks are international, so the regulation is largely devised in Basel without really asking the specific nations what they think. They're really represented by the central bankers rather than directly represented. So the ICT revolution, by expanding markets, has also expanded the state and moved powers up out of the local community. The last aspect of this is to the community itself. The market disruption has created some places which are really terribly adversely affected by the loss of jobs. And it doesn't stop there. As the jobs leave, social disintegration sets in. What you see in the work, for example, by Angus Deaton and Anne Case, is tremendous effects locally, so much so that death rates have increased tremendously amongst the displaced white members of society. But you can see this regardless of race in effects on marriage. Marriages break down, more divorces, later marriages or no marriages, more children born out of wedlock, families break down, there's a lot more substance abuse, there's more crime. And the breakdown of the local community then breaks down local community institutions. Schools become much worse off when the local community is breaking down. And remember, the way out of this for many people is to get a better education, to get more training in particular jobs. But as the community institutions break down, as the schools break down, as the community colleges break down, that ladder to further to alternative economic careers essentially breaks down. So what we see is technological change has increased the importance of good schooling as the entryway to jobs. But in fact, it makes it much harder in some places to get that. And in particular, in these communities that are breaking down, you see a migration of the successful away from the community. Why stay here and send my kids to a lousy school? Why not go to the big city or to some other place where, one, I get a better job, but also my children have a better access to education? So agglomeration economies can be, this is what economists, this is the term economists use for the fact that a lot of highly skilled people like to agglomerate together in the big cities. One reason for that could be they're more productive in the big cities. Another reason for that could be they find more resources for their kids and their families in the big cities. The successful tend to live together, creating more diversity within countries, which becomes problematic. So the community has weakened because it's been differentially hit by market forces. It has been disempowered by the state and is now disintegrating under the combination of attacks. And if you see the big concern, for example, in the United States, massive areas which feel they've not participated in the economic growth over the last 20 or 30 years, which creates the grounds for populist leaders to make their pitch. So broadly, I am emphasizing the renewed importance of place. Let me spend the last 5 minutes, 5 minutes on the pandemic itself, and finally on responses. The pandemic, in some ways, has exacerbated every economic fault line that existed earlier. The low-paid workers are the workers on the front line who are in the shops, who are in as nurses in the hospitals. They are, affected obviously by the pandemic. They have higher death rates as a result, but they are also, in many ways, they're more likely to be unemployed as the pandemic hits. While the people like you and me can sit at home and do much of our work online, 45% of the jobs in rich countries can be done at home. In poorer countries, much lower percentages. But even in rich countries, 55% are basically unable to work. And these are the guys who are typically lower skilled. So that inequality is something that has been exacerbated. Even the reaction to the pandemic, these successful reactions have been more decentralized, as for example, Germany and South Korea, the federal government setting an overall framework and localities deciding how far they want to go. Instead, some of the worst responses have been centralized. For example, the massive lockdown in India, which shut down business and had devastating effects on the economy without, in some ways, doing an effective job on the virus. Now, in many of these situations, the local community has been critical in filling holes, and that leads to a broader sort of point. Can they be part of the bigger solutions to the problems of society? For example, in a number of communities, because the elderly cannot go out and buy their food, young people have sort of volunteered and buy the food for the elderly, even in situations where they're not part of the family of the elderly. Communities have come together. They've come together to help migrants who have no support and essentially, provide for them even when government safety nets break down or are insufficient. Many communities are policing social distancing themselves and trying to make sure that people sort of behave in the interests of the community. And of course, some communities have started food banks and so on for those who don't have support. So essentially, what communities are doing is stepping up. What are the consequences? And let me sort of go to solutions after this. What are the consequences if we don't deal with this increasing, on the one hand, need for the community, but the inability of the community to provide because it's breaking down in many ways? I think what we see is fake communities. Nationalism is a form of emphasis on the national community, even though it's sort of an imagined idea, according to Benedict Anderson. And that idea tends to displace the local community, especially when the local community is ineffective and weak. But nationalism has its own consequences, and we have seen that it can be quite brutal in the past. And the worry is, if we don't revive the community, we will see much more of a movement towards nationalism across countries. So what am I advocating? On the one hand, I would advocate pushing power back from the international arena to the national, in the national, from the capital to the local area. And one example of this is what is called the principle of subsidiarity, which essentially requires you to push power down to the lowest level that can handle them effectively. So what this means is, for example, if you have emissions in the country, each locality doesn't put its own emission regulation on the cars. That would make it impossible for cars to travel anywhere. Instead, there's a national emission regulation. But if you're talking about minimum wages or about shopping hours for businesses, that could be determined locally. One country which does this quite effectively is Switzerland. And it does this, for example, with education. The federal institutes of education are all taken care of by the federal government. The high schools are the responsibility of the 26 cantons. And the primary schools are the responsibility of the 3,000 municipalities. So each area of government, each level of government has something to take care of, which means the people in that municipality can have some influence over what is taught in their schools, have some participation in governance. And that is really important to deal with the disempowerment that otherwise is experienced when you have globalization and the centralization of power. The other thing that I think is possible today, which needs to be thought of, is if you empower these communities, they can also attract jobs more effectively. We've already talked about the fact that more jobs can be done at a distance. And that experience from the pandemic will allow us to do far more. If people stayed instead of in the cities, but 200 miles from the city, going in once a week because they need to be at their office, but not going in every day, they could bring their job to a locality which is 200 miles away. And in that locality, they could bring their incomes for spending, they could generate more activity there, and they could also provide a certain amount of community leadership in addition to the leadership already provided by the people there. So effectively, what I'm arguing is that even though technology has been responsible for the breakdown in communities, it can also be part of the answer. It can create a spreading of jobs, which then allows for more revival in remote places. One example I want to give, just because it's an interesting one, technology also enables access for small niche markets to a larger national market. So, for example, there is a firm run by an Amish family in Ohio, which has built a flourishing business selling high-tech horse-drawn farm equipment, horse-drawn in this modern age. Now, you might ask, what market is there for horse-drawn farm equipment? Why would anybody want to buy that stuff? Well, it turns out that there are a lot of Amish farms across the United States. This is a community which believes that it is not correct to use modern technology. They want older technology. And so these farm equipment are sold across the United States. But technology, the ability to advertise on the internet, the ability to reach these farms across the United States is now possible, while it would have been very difficult in the past. So what the small farm equipment manufacturer gets is the ability to occupy a niche market but sell across the entire country. So the the point I want to make is that it is possible now to get economic activity more widespread, and that would allow for stronger communities with an economic base. And I would argue, and that's the last point I'm going to make, that this kind of inclusiveness can allow us, this kind of localism can allow us to give people in those communities a sense of empowerment, a sense that they have the ability to deal with the forces of globalization. And it can also, in a sense, strengthen their ability to prepare for those forces with strong local institutions like good schools and good community colleges, which can prepare them for the jobs. Last point, what about broken communities? There are, as I've said, there are many broken communities. Some have historically been disadvantaged and poor. Some are newly poor. In many of these cases, the problem is one of development. How do you get these places to develop? And as anybody who's worked in development knows, there are no easy answers. But amongst the answers are first leadership. If you can get strong local leadership to say, we are going to change, we are going to make the change, that is half the battle won. One of the communities in Chicago is a community called Pilsen, which I write about in the book. In the 1980s, it was gang warfare which occupied Pilsen. There were 21 gangs in 2 miles. The death rate because of gang warfare was exceeded the death rate on the Eastern Front in the height of World War II. So this was really a war zone. But some community people got together and said, we need to make a change. And as they thought about the change, the first thing they did was to bring down crime. And they brought down crime often by using the community. The community came out on the streets when a crime happened so that those criminals didn't have much space to go. They retook the streets from the criminals. They shut down the bars where the criminals congregated. They asked local businesses to give jobs to the gang leaders and to the gang members. And so over time, they actually made crime rates go down and the area much more favorable to businesses. So this is something, community engagement along with community leadership can be very important. Again, technology allows greater community engagement. Many of you know the role of social media in bringing together people, but it can also allow people to monitor community leadership. For example, there's an app called the See Click Fix app. If I see a pothole in the community, I point at that pothole, take a picture, it goes to the community website. It stays there until that pothole is fixed by the community officials. That's one example of how technology can help. Now, this doesn't mean communities can revive on their own. They do benefit from help. Infrastructure is often very important. Sometimes building out a park because land is cheap, creating more access to that particular locality by stronger transportation links. All of these can help a community get more economic activity, attract people into the community because they see, on the one hand, rents are cheap. On the other hand, there are plenty of resources and they want to live there. Pilsen now has the benefit of a lot of people in Chicago wanting to live there because it's a new, exciting community and it's not that costly. Of course, this leads to the question of whether it makes it too costly for the existing residents to stay there, the problem of gentrification. Happy to talk about that in the questions. Last support that is needed is funding. Sometimes to start the virtuous circle of development of growth, you need some funding. The problem is much of the funding to these communities comes with strong strings attached. Governments say you can spend on this, not that. This prevents the community from devising its own solutions to the problems it has. So going forward, getting funding without strings, not just from the government, but from impact investors, from philanthropies, all this is important for community revival. And there are many examples of communities which have used these tools to come back, and studying what they do well, sharing best experiences is important. I'll end by saying I'm emphasizing localism that is creating more empowered communities with short walls around them to give them a greater sense of identity so that they can deal with the forces of globalization and technological change. And also, this may be where the human jobs of the future lie. As we get displaced by machines, more human intensive jobs, helping people deal with loneliness, helping the elderly just by showing up and saying hello. These may be where, in fact, the jobs lie in the future. So communities can be part of our future. The final point is the problem with localism in the past has been localism has become a form of segregation. We know about these gated communities. In the United States, states' rights is often something that was invoked by Southern segregationists who wanted the ability to have their own policies vis-a-vis the African-American population. So I would say that we want localism, but we want it to be tempered by the need to be inclusive. So that is, if I were to argue for a role for the central government, for the federal government, it would be to keep the walls around the communities low, not to make them so high that they segregate people, they exclude people. So by all means, the laws against discrimination should be enforced. This really implies a trade-off. Low so that flows can take place across the community walls, people can go across, come in and go out, trade can come in and go out, but high enough, moderately high, so that the community has a greater sense of identity. And this is something that many countries have achieved. It is something that needs to be revisited. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Raghu. Quite interesting.
Do you want to start, Jose? I have many.
Yeah.
I
have one question since I started when I read your book and all this discussion about the communities and the problem with communities as the tensions that were served in development. And this is typical case of globalization. Sometimes we take a good measure, opening up the economy, okay? And everybody in the country gets 0.5 gain in income. but there are a couple of communities where the pain and the loss is concentrated. So you argue that, and this has been the discussion in recent years with the accession of China and everything, the need for some compensation. How you think that this can be done in an efficient way, the compensation of these transitions? Because otherwise, we may get paralyzed and not implement reforms because of this differential cost.
Yeah. It's a great question, and you know, this is the whole economist's argument, right? If there are gains to trade, you should be able to compensate the losers because the gains are sufficient to compensate. But there are problems in this traditional argument. First, we never get around to compensating the losers. You know, trade adjustment in the U.S. is a form of compensation to allow workers to readjust. Works very poorly, doesn't make a big difference in these communities. Part of the reason is the problem is not just of money. The problem is organizing. How do you rebuild the community? The community just lost its biggest employer. How do you rebuild the functions of the community? Because, you know, if you want people to look for new jobs, they need new skills. But for that, you need a strong community college, or you need a strong link to a university. But that doesn't exist, or that it doesn't have the appropriate funds. So the funds have to come into the community. The community has to decide on what to spend on. And that will be a way to rebuild the community, right? So a lot of the adjustment funds are often determined in the center, don't give too much leeway for the locals to do anything. And often the locals aren't organized enough to accept those funds and to do something. So this results in some funds come, it's misspent, and then the people at the center see what happens when we send the funds, let's not send any more. And essentially the problem doesn't get solved. And this is why I think it has to be a bottom-up effort, partly from the community, but partly in the sending. The sending can't have so many strings attached. It can't be, you will create your school in this way with 4 walls here and 3 walls there, but instead it has to be, spend this money in the way you think is most effective. We'll of course monitor what you know, that you're not giving it to your friends and relatives, but we'll be fairly open about how it's spent. That kind of money can catalyze a lot. One example, I mean, in Pilsen, during the global financial crisis, the community bank failed. The community bank failed, which meant that all the mortgages it had made would now be, if it was liquidated, all of them would be, in a sense, you know, they would be liquidated also. And a whole number of houses would go vacant because the occupants would be evicted. 32% of the mortgages were in default. Instead, the community got funding to provide equity to the bank. Then they worked with the borrowers to keep them in their homes because there was an externality. They stayed in their homes. Those homes didn't become drug houses and crime would not go up. It would be a relatively benefit for the whole community. And essentially by internalizing the externality, the language of economists, they managed to bring the bad loans down, and it's a flourishing community bank. That's an example of trusting the community to figure out how to do it.
I love this emphasis on the community, Raghu. Congratulations again for some incredible insight. The first question, I have many questions, but let me start with the first one. Does the IMF and the World Bank share your view about the importance of these local communities? And what has been the reaction when you have spoken to them about this view?
You know, very positive, but of course the IMF and the World Bank have many sort of facets, right? Yeah. The temptation in, building communities is very hard. Building countries is hard, but at least there's somebody to talk to on the other side. If you're the IMF and going, there's nobody from the community to talk to you. So figuring out these kinds of things is just you know, is an order of magnitude higher. The problem in some of these is the exercise can become very bureaucratic. As you know, the World Bank for some time has been thinking about bottom-up development, so that is completely consistent with this. But the way they do it is here's a policy. Now you got to debate it all the way down to the local level, and then it comes up. It takes 4 years to decide anything because it's still centralized. It's just that it has got bottom-up consensus. I think what you have to do is trust the locals more and let the locals figure it out with a whole lot of bureaucracy. And for centralized organizations, that's going to be difficult, but that is the way to go, in my view.
And this leads to one of the questions that from someone in the chat that I had that question as well. This is from Valeria, but so let me read it. She actually said it much better than I did. So, what are the flaws of a system based on subsidiarity principles? Is there anything that we should be concerned?
Well, I mean, clearly every system has its own problems, right? And one of the so whenever I talk about trusting the people, I immediately get the reaction in the United States. Well, if you let them manage what is taught in their schools, they'll all teach creationism. Okay, so this is a very elite response, and I don't want to, I don't want to go to the wrong place on this. What I want to say is, I mean, that may be an appropriate reaction in some very religious communities. They value the teaching of creationism more than the alternatives. Yes, you may think they are misinformed relative to the broader public, but if they're not applying for jobs in biotech, maybe it doesn't matter that much, so long as they have good skills in other areas which get them good jobs. If in fact they want their kids to go and become doctors or do biotech and so on, maybe they will figure out that there's a cost to teaching creationism. The kids who come back will say it didn't work well, and they will change. In other words, what I'm saying is the empowerment should allow the ability to make mistakes. That's how people learn. If you don't allow that and you thrust things from the center, you make perhaps even bigger mistakes. Since I'm on this, let me just, if you go from the University of Chicago back to the center of town, you'll pass a huge set of projects. These are now, many of them are being closed down. These are big, huge buildings where the poor were put in the 50s and the 60s. And they found, this was the fad of the moment at that time, right? And it was found to be terrible because it isolated the poor and didn't give them any kind of membership in a broader community. And that was a way of entrenching poverty. Now, of course, the new fad is let's spread them around in strong communities. And I've no doubt it's based on evidence. It may work better, but we should resist, in a sense, having a common solution to everything because it inhibits learning, and we may end up making big mistakes once again.
There is a question which I think that is an issue in Latin America, everywhere in the world, and strengthening communities and the impact of immigration on the strength of communities and how we can handle the issues of immigration with the strengthening communities.
This is a great question because, I mean, some of the resistance to immigration comes because the cost of immigrants is often borne by poorer communities without much support. And the same questions that richer communities might have sort of pervade the poorer community. And I'm not trying, I am an immigrant myself, so let me just say this very clearly, that immigrants are in the short run very costly. In the long run, they may be very beneficial, but in the short run, when an immigrant child who doesn't know the language comes into the school, she requires more attention from the teacher, right? So the right way to deal with this is to provide more resources in those communities. But these are poor communities which have bad schools in the beginning to start with, because and they're cheap because because of the bad schools, etc. That's why the immigrants come there. But if they are afforded no further support, the local worker basically says, immigration is hurting me because it's hurting the quality of instruction in my school, which was too bad to begin with. So the way to really integrate immigrants is to make sure that the cost that they impose initially is borne more widely. I think Germany does a reasonable job of this. Other countries should learn from this. But in the longer run, I think they're very beneficial, because those kids, now that they know the language, they're hungry, they're eager, they're smart, they do well. But we need to find ways of assimilation. Now, last point I'll make. What we need to do is to allow for different kinds of communities to emerge. I mean, one of the concerns with immigration often is the loss of national culture. But if some community groups feel that national culture is particularly important, they can congregate together and celebrate the national culture there. By decentralizing to the community, you don't need the national culture to be imposed on each and every community that they exist. Over time, it will. People absorb the national culture because they go to the schools, they read the newspapers, etc. But it doesn't have to be imposed uniformly. Some may be much more focused on the national culture, others may be more immigrant oriented. But in the longer run, there will be a more vibrant sort of culture which will emerge by the convex combination of the two. So communities allow us to deal with diversity in a far more effective way than the alternative, which is let's impose it on everyone.
In fact, related to that, I have two questions. One is your definition of community is very geographically determined. So it's because so it's not a critique. I'm just asking a question. Is it because we allocate government resources locally? So we could think about different set of communities, not the fake ones, but different forms of organizing communities. If we could actually change the expenditures of the government to be related to that type of arrangement as opposed to locally. Is my assessment correct in this sense?
It's absolutely right. I mean, to some extent, this is the biggest problem the biggest sort of question that I had to debate as I wrote the book, right? Because if I talk to some of my colleagues, one will say, my community is let me not say colleagues. I talked to one person who was a big critic of the book, and he said, my community is rich Jewish white men, and they don't all exist in this one place, and they're spread all over the world, but I communicate with them, they're my community. Yeah, that is true. And in fact, many people in the cities don't really belong to the local neighborhood. They belong to an internet community. Immigrants have a much stronger relationship to their relatives at home, and that's made possible by new methods of communication. So one of the reasons I focused on the local community is because of governance, what you just said, that we govern on the basis of place. Second is, I think the biggest problem is the economic activity is dispersed across place. So getting it to the places that have been left behind in some sense will reduce some of the anxiety. So that's the second reason to focus on that. But I do think, and I do talk about the internet community and so on, over time, we will have to figure out how to bring some of these concerns to that. It still seems to me that your neighbor is more likely to help you if you have a heart attack than somebody that you met online, but that may change. And therefore, place may become less important. Absolutely.
I see. Can you? I love the fake community example that you have, and because it's related to this, can you give me other notions of fake community? I'm planning to use this in class at some point. So, one is this false sense of nationalism. So,
yes. No. I think that we are social creatures, and we have a very deep need to belong. Let me elaborate on that earlier point, because I think that's and what I think the populist nationalists find is that that desire to belong, especially amongst those who are rootless, who are displaced, and I'm not original here. Hannah Arendt, for example, has talked about this. the populist nationalists offer that warm and welcoming national community, as if, you know, some person who happens to be white far away will welcome this person who happens to be white in this place, even though they are divided by culture, by national origin, it's just that skin color somehow creates this massive bond. And the worry with that is that the way it holds together is really by strengthening the fear of the enemy. The enemy is non-white. Therefore, now you know that you're a block against them, and therefore, sometimes the enemy becomes innocuous. And then when that enemy becomes innocuous, when you've demolished the domestic sort of enemies, the minorities, you put them in a place, then the problem comes, how do I hold together the coalition? And then I have to find international enemies, because they're still out there, they're still strong. So if it's not, the minorities, then it becomes the Chinese, or it becomes the Indians, or it becomes somebody else that are the threat to our national view. So my worry is this kind of don't get me wrong, I think patriotism is a very strong and powerful force for good also. But parochial nationalism or jingoism, to my mind, is a strong force for the bad. And how do we separate the two? How are we patriotic about the good things about our country and the force that builds enormous highways and bridges and so on, versus what is problematic, which treats the other as an enemy, regardless of what they do.
I have two questions regarding what one big concern in Latin America, for example, of decentralizing to communities without doing it well is the pervasive corruption in many localities, and of course that's not the idea that you have a communities, but it's, I would say, kind of the trade-off if you don't do it well.
Yeah.
And the second concern that I also have regarding your discussion about COVID, because COVID needs a centralized solution because it's a big coordination problem, but of course communities can help a lot.
Yeah.
And we have you said India is a case in which there was just a top-down view and just full lockdown, but then you have the US and Brazil, which you could say are the cases more decentralized in terms of solution, which has been also quite a problematic. Again, there is a problem of how you solve the tension between the need for centralization and the help from communities.
Right. Now, so let me take both questions. On the corruption side, you're absolutely right. And this is, to some extent, if you think about economic theory, the quality of local officials is always going to be less than the quality of national officials, right? National officials are recruited on a much bigger scale, from a much bigger labor force. And therefore, even if you just did the same recruitment measures, you would find higher quality national officials rather than local officials. You're also constrained with local officials. They want to stay locally, and that limits your choice. So it is possible that there is naturally more affinity for corruption locally than nationally. However, I would argue that today we have the means to deal with that more effectively than in the past. So I'm not advocating just upping the amounts you send locally without any change. I would certainly suggest that we have better methods of accounting, of monitoring the expenditure. But with automation, with technology, we have much better ways of doing it. And so it seems to me that the benefit of new technologies is that you can decentralize a little more while keeping the same level of accountability. And I would publicize locally what it is spent on. Maybe that is a requirement of the funds. Maybe it is something the center could do. Here is what came, here's what was spent. And so the local officials now have the eyes of the local public also to see what happened. Corruption thrives in the absence of transparency. Even in a place like, there are these studies on Kenya and Uganda, where once you publicized what the schools got, the spending became far more effective, because a lot of the money was being stolen earlier. Now the officials had to show what they spent on and point to the actual, books that they bought or the food that they gave the kids. So I think that's one. On the COVID, I'm not arguing that the response was the optimal response was full decentralization. I'm saying COVID reflects a particular situation where you do need, in a sense, a focus on the principle of subsidiarity. You do want a national response because the nation can create production facilities, this, that, more effectively than the local area. And you don't want the local areas competing with each other to buy scarce masks, because that transfers the rents to the private sector, which may not be in the best position to push it back into the broader public. So that amount of coordination is needed, including standards. If you open up, maybe these are the minimum standards, so that I can trust that when that area opens up, my people in my area can go there without fear, because it's a common standard, right? So standards, management, supplies, those are important. But the degree of local restriction is something the local authorities can determine. How many elderly people do we have? How many hospitals do we have? How dangerous is it if we allow this kind of mingling, that kind of mingling? What are the festivals that are more problematic here than elsewhere? So a lot of decentralized actions are also possible. And that's the real point. The mix would be great.
Yeah, also the type of jobs are very different locally. So it is
Exactly.
conceivable that the jobs that I have locally are already,
Distance.
imply distance. So
Exactly.
I don't need the same.
Precisely. And I think the examples you gave, Brazil and the US, were where the center took a hands-off approach for a long time. Without, in the US, they didn't, arrange for the medical equipment in an effective way. I mean, I think there's more that was done that is not publicized, but they didn't do it effectively.
I have a couple of questions about creation of community, and many of the questions in the Q&A are related to that. So one that I found very interesting is about the role that firms and big corporations can have in the creation of community. So what is your view on what are the type of actions that the private sector could take?
Well, private sector now increasingly, as you know, have been, sort of become more willing to talk about other stakeholders, including the community stakeholders in them. The difficulty in many situations is if you have a large public corporation, which is headquartered far away, it doesn't see a lot of what happens locally. And often the local factory is disempowered. They can't really support too many community activities. And one of the concerns is, as firms become much bigger and as communication technology becomes stronger, the firms themselves become more centralized. And therefore, the ability for local operations to work with local communities becomes harder. So one of the things that some firms are starting to do is, at least on the community interaction, trying to decentralize more responsibilities locally, so that the local factory or the local bank branch can support the local school in certain kinds of activities. Now, the key here is, how much support and what is the right kind of support. And often the right kind of support is support where it's in the same sort of line of activity that the firm is doing, because then it knows how to do that reasonably well. It doesn't detract from its larger activity. And if it's a win-win situation, I'm giving out more local loans to train local entrepreneurs. That's good for the community. That's good for my banking business. That's a win-win situation. I'm less, sure that some of these peripheral activities, I'm told to do corporate social responsibility activities, and I just spend it on something which is not related to me, not necessarily what the community wants. Those may not be that effective. Basically, again, this talks about coordination between community leadership and the businesses themselves. And I won't, I'm of the view that a business that makes a good widget is doing 90% of what we wanted to do. And I won't overemphasize the need for this other stuff. I mean, they can help, but often the help should come in activities that they're better at doing.
Yeah, this is the governance view is a super interesting one, Raghu. I didn't think about that. So in other words, firms tend to be more centralized than governments themselves already.
Yeah.
So kind of that. So it will be harder for them to do any decentralization. So how can you be more specific about what will you do to strengthen communities? Everything that you have spoken, some of the examples you have given about populists trying to find a former enemy, like we in Latin America, we all have suffered from that. All the people from Venezuela right now, when you were saying the enemies are Russia and China, they were thinking about the search and replace on all the speeches from Chavez that he was actually trying to get these enemies. So a lot of what you have said is something that we suffer tremendously in Latin America. So how do we strengthen the communities in an emerging economy?
So Roberto, I mean, this is the $1 trillion question, right? And some of the thought process for this book started off by seeing the communities in India, which historically were very strong, but because of centralization, government centralization, and so on, have become disempowered. And today, instead of people coming together to dig up a volleyball court, they're waiting for the government to come and do it for them. So this is totally disempowering, and in a sense, I think community action needs to be built back up. The problem is really the same as the problem of development. How do you get countries to develop? How do you get them to get that magic set of things together? I would argue that in the development literature, we know 300 things that are associated with development, but we don't know how to start development, right? We know, it's associated with good institutions, it's associated with less diversity, ethno-linguistic diversity is a problem. I mean, we know all these, but we really don't know how we got South Korea, and we didn't get a similar phenomenon in, say, Sudan. Why did South Korea develop and Sudan not? I do think that it is possible to create the right environment, and that's what I've been pushing for. But ultimately, that catalyst, how do people then come together and say, we must do it? That's the big unknown. It's the formation of community will, of community leadership. You can create the conditions, but you can't create it from outside because that's an imposition. Yep. And situations where they've tried to create it from the center, okay, we're going to strengthen activist groups, etc. There was a big effort in the United States in the 60s under President Johnson in the fight against poverty, and it flopped. It was an attempt to create communities, but it ended up creating power structures which were centrally supported, which were different from the local power structures. And they fought each other, and the community didn't benefit. So this is a tough point. More work needs to be done, but I think you can identify the conditions, and at least let's create the conditions and then see what happens.
I think that to a large extent, what you have been arguing, which is a thing that I have been thinking a lot, and it's a big issue in Chile and other Latin American countries, is how to decentralize, how to transfer power to, it's not necessary to get to the communities, but to get to regions that are pretty much disconnected from the center, and decisions are much better taken by local communities than by the center. So then the tension is how you build institutions that guarantee, first, for macroeconomies, that is a fiscally responsible decentralization, and also with the incentives, appropriate incentives for them to use better the resources.
Exactly, and the problem with decentralization, just right off the bat, is obviously the people who have been elected to represent them there were based on the old regime where they had nothing to do. So I elect anybody. But if you give them more power, more funding, you may get better people elected. But how do you, what comes first, the power and the funding or the election? And that is the chicken and egg problem that sometimes needs to be solved. And that's, that becomes an impossible hurdle. Am I going to send money to that guy? He's totally corrupt. I know he's corrupt. Why would I send money to him? You need to break that.
In fact, there are many restrictions, there are many ingredients here. So one is the public official, but implicitly in everything that you are saying is that the community has to have a vision of what they want to build, implicitly. So
they have to develop that, absolutely, and they will make mistakes. I mean, there is no development path which is without mistakes,
yeah.
but learning by doing is part of what is needed, right? And the problem is this often gets stopped at the first point. We don't trust them enough, so we don't decentralize, and we trust ourselves too much, and that's, so we need to break some of those. That's why I think this is more a movement. I do want to put another reason for this, which is as markets become more volatile, the incentive to centralize power is going to become even stronger. I mean, think about, for example, universal basic income. If we get universal basic income, almost everyone, on that will be a direct employee of the government.
Yeah.
Think of the tremendous power that the central government will have then, right? And as you know, one of the biggest questions in political economy is how do we get effective government, but how do we also control that government? And I think the decentralization will be an effective check and balance, but we need to know how to do it better.
Thank you
So
so much.
you are a bit skeptical about the universal basic income because of the power of the state against local communities.
I think it's too early to have it, but eventually we may need something like that. But I would say even then we should be worried a lot about putting a lot of people on the government payroll, because then if I don't like you, you've been talking too much, suddenly you find your checks are delayed. That's a good way of bringing you back into line, because I can delay it saying, I don't know what happened. There's some software glitch which doesn't make me pay. There are many methods of control.
Or you put a tiny conditionality on the UBI and then you're all done.
Right.
So,
right.
Which is,
right. If you are shameless as a government, you can make explicit conditionality.
Yeah, exactly.
If there is still some shame, you will make it implicit, but it is the same effect.
Can you give us some more minutes, Raghu? So I want to be also. One of the things that I was thinking is that, let me try to summarize and see. So one, you need the willingness to decentralize. Then you need the pragmatism, so that these local governments experiment, but they don't become ideological, because then we will use this incorrectly. And then we need the communities to have a vision. Is that a good summary of the ingredients that we will need? So, the reason, this is probably very selfish reason, I want to have a list of things to do so I can recommend all the Venezuelans what we need to do.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
that would be difficult.
That's an interesting. No, I have. One of the countries which I don't want to. I want to qualify, because it may be. It may raise the wrong sort of. Maybe taken wrongly. One of the countries that's been very successful at local empowerment is China, till recently, because what the Chinese did was put up and coming members of the Communist Party in charge of the local area, and they were competing on performance. How strongly do I let my local community grow? And there were obvious problems that sometimes communities fought each other. I don't want to let your goods in me and enter, but the overall party tried to paper over those things. But if my colleague Chiang Tai-shek makes this point, that if you look at the overall ease of doing business in China, it's terrible. It's really quite hard if you respect all the rules. What the local official did was break the rules for you. You respect this rule, not that rule, and I'll take care of you. I'll protect you because I'm linked all the way up the Communist Party. That also led to corruption. What has happened now is that local government official has become a little more subdued, because the center has said, I can move against you, and it picks and chooses who it moves against. If you were friends with the old guy, then I move more strongly against you than if you're friends with the new guy. So I think that sort of that kind of local enthusiasm has diminished a little bit. I know they will have to find some ways to replace that, because it's much harder, if you respect all the rules, to open businesses in China. Maybe what they do is become more transparent all along the line, but I suspect they will discover some other way of doing it. But that's an example of the local empowerment, but it required a one-party rule where the one party resolved the differences between the local communities, and the one party also rewarded the guys who did well by promoting them up. So maybe it doesn't work elsewhere.
This is perfect. Let me first thank you so much for all your time and generosity, Raghu, for this. This is I think this is the development month in our talks, because today we started with Raghu. In 2 weeks from now, we will have Esther Duflo. So we will be continue this conversation about development and try to think about how we can use all your lessons to apply it to the region. Thank you so much for this. Jose, do you want to say something?
Yeah, it was great. I think that we learned a lot. I also like the way, as very transparent you say. There was this phrase that I got very impressed, which is sometimes it's not politically correct, but you say in the short run, immigration is costly. And so because there is this kind of these two polar, those that don't like immigration at all, and those that say it's very good, but it's very good, but we need to also deal with the tensions, and these tensions, especially in some poor local communities. And if we are not serious about that, of course, we will be doing very bad policies, and especially in economies that need a big boost in order to progress and to grow. So I was a great presentation. It will be posted on the web so people can watch it again. We also like to thank to Radio Cooperativa, a network radio that also published this and transmitted it live. So we have a lot of people at home hearing it even without watching it. So it was great. Great to our partners, and great to have you here. So
thank you. Thanks for having me, and good luck on the future talks.
Thank you so much, Raghu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raghu.